One of my earliest memories as a child, and I probably must have been around 4 years old, 3 years old. I was living in a suburb of Atlanta, and my parents had us in the living room, and there were people coming to our door, and there was a large bowl of candy. I still remember that large bowl of candy, and these kids were taking my candy. I would have loved to have all that candy, but it was being given away. Now, this was just prior to us coming into the church, and so we weren't allowed to trick or treat, but we were still giving away candy, so I guess we were in that halfway zone at that point. But that's one of the few early memories I do have. It must have stuck with me because of the candy involved and someone else getting it. But this, of course, is the time of year when we see all those decorations and yards next to ours going down our street. Our grandkids have been with us the last few days, and one of them in particular is very fascinated by the decor. And of course, he knows we don't celebrate it, but still, it's fascinating to see these things in the yard. And I think he enjoys seeing what kind of fascinating creatures and all is there. He doesn't understand, of course, the nature of Halloween yet and that kind of thing. But it is interesting. Those of you who have kids, it's always a bit of a challenge. How do you explain these things in a way that they don't just blurt something out that becomes very embarrassing or very hurtful to someone else, because they, at a very early age, they're, of course, unable to discern whether it's appropriate to say, you're an evil person, because, you just have to be careful what you say, because they tend to repeat it. And so oftentimes we are faced with those challenges as parents and grandparents. It is that time of year, of course, where there are plenty of object lessons in the world around us today. Of course, the reason people are keeping this holiday is interesting. I'm sure most of you have read about the history and origins of Halloween. We'll talk just a little bit about that today. But I wanted to go, first of all, back to Genesis chapter 3, because if it wasn't for this, there would be no Halloween. The whole basis of it is based on a deception that we find back in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 4. We know it as the first lie, at least the first lie recorded in the Bible, the first lie that we have recorded with, after humanity was created. Genesis 3 verse 4, where Satan tells Eve, "You will not surely die." Now, of course, God had said, if you eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die. But Satan is countering God. No, you're not going to die. And of course, we see this as the very beginning of what became the doctrine of the immortality of the soul within the church or Christian community. Prior to that was a pagan concept that everyone has a soul, that when you die, you live on. And obviously, it goes back to the very time of Adam and Eve when Satan said, "You will not. You're not going to die." The idea that you can live on. It says, God knows the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Knowing good and evil. And of course, we recognize that in this world, there is a mixture of good and evil. In fact, just walking down our neighborhood streets, you'll see some people that have decorated their homes in with the fall themes, and they're staying away from the evil themes that some others have skeletons and all this scary stuff. You see, the fall, which is fine, and you see the other all mixed together on the streets that we live on during this time of year. Won't be long, of course, that the Christmas decorations will be, I think I saw one house already going up. And down the road from us. But a whole other pagan holiday will be celebrated. But in this case, in the case of Halloween, it's a growing festival. It's something that's taking on more and more popularity, especially considering the meager beginnings that it had in our country. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but I found it interesting that economically, the amount of spending on Halloween items back in 2015 was $7 billion in our country, $7 billion. Of course, last year's Halloween wasn't as big of a deal, because of COVID. But this year, according to Business Insider, they are expecting that we will have a record $10.5 billion spent on Halloween items. Candy, costumes, anything like that. From $7 billion to $10 billion in just a few years. It is, and compared to last year, they're estimating candy sales are surging almost 30%. 30% more this year than last year. Of course, that would be expected considering Halloween was kind of interrupted to some extent by COVID last year. But another article I was reading talks about how it used to be primarily a children's thing, go trick-or-treating, but now it is increasingly growing to be a major consumer holiday for those 18 to 34, in that age range. And older adults who seize the opportunity for a night of, quote, escapism. Get away from the world as we know it, kind of live in a fantasy, and more people are participating in this. Interestingly enough, just a few years ago, I don't know what it is this year, but people spent $350 million costuming their pets. Even the pets. They're unable to voice their opposition. Their owners are forcing them to dress up at Halloween. Well, as I mentioned, the origins of Halloween are quite interesting, and it's amazing. And now with the internet, it's so easy to find. Before, we would have to go to World Book Encyclopedia or something else, but you can find it all over the place anymore. I'll just review it very quickly without spending a lot of time with it. But the origin of Halloween is an ancient Celtic festival named Samhain, which was the god of death for the Celts, the Celtic peoples. And that's the source of it. The Celts lived more than 2,000 years ago in what is now Great Britain, Ireland, and northern France. And the new year began on November 1st. Their new year did. And the festival began the previous evening to honor the Celtic god of death, Samhain. And the celebration marked the beginning of the cold, darkness, and decay that was coming in the winter, and it naturally became associated with human death. The Celts believed that Samhain allowed the souls of the dead to return to their earthly homes for that evening. So the barrier between the netherworld, the world of the dead, because, they have an immortal soul, they're still alive. They may exist as a ghost or a goblin or something else, but they're still alive. And they can come and they can return to where they were before, return to the earth as we know it. And of course, nobody wants to be haunted by a spirit. And so they would dress up in costumes, look differently so these spirits wouldn't know who they were. And have your enemies come back and curse you in some way. You got to look different. And so that's part of the reason we have the dressing up as we do. It goes on to say, in another article here, that Halloween, as we know it today, is the combination of two separate observances: All Saints' Day, or All Hallows' Eve, and the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain. All Saints' Day was observed and created by the Roman Catholic Church to honor all the saints that weren't assigned a specific day of commemoration. After Catholicism was legalized and became after Catholicism, I should say, was legalized and became the state religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the Roman Church developed a tradition called canonization. And this was the process of declaring a man or a woman a saint because of some heroic deed or act of faith. Those declared saints could be venerated and prayed to as an intermediary to God. Eventually, the tradition developed to honor such a particular saint on a particular day. And each saint would have his day. You could pray and venerate that saint. But by the 7th century, the Roman Church had so many saints they couldn't give another day they didn't have any more days left to give the saints. So they declared May 13th to be All Saints' Day. Every saint that doesn't have a day of his own or her own, this is the day that we honor them, that we venerate them. Now, it was moved by Pope Gregory IV in the 9th century to November 1st. Why? Well, it was to counter this pagan festival. as we know, Halloween, but back then Samhain. The article goes on to say it's generally accepted as a historical fact that November 1st was selected to counteract the pagan celebrations held on that day. In other words, to appeal to the pagan masses, a day was selected for the celebration that was already being observed by the pagans in an attempt to easily transfer their loyalties. They could continue keeping their former celebration and many of its customs, but now under the Christian banner. Just worship, we'll just keep it in honoring not of all these other dead people, but the saints who have died. Very similar. We'll just kind of switch the meaning, make it Christian. This is the basic origin of many of the mainstream Christian holidays that we see today. The pagan festival, it replaced being Samhain. Samhain marked the end of the harvest, the beginning of winter, and it was celebrated by lighting a large sacrificial bonfire where crops were burned to honor the gods, and costumes were worn to ward off spirits of the dead that were believed to rise and wander the earth the evening of October the 31st. According to the Encyclopedia of Religion, they write that both the evening and the day of Samhain were thought to be a time when the barriers between human and the supernatural worlds were broken, allowing passage between the two. Otherworldly entities such as the souls of the dead were able to visit their earthly inhabitants, and humans could take the opportunity to penetrate the domains of the gods and the supernatural creatures. Fiery tributes of sacrifices of animals, crops, and possibly human beings were made to appease the supernatural powers that controlled the fertility of the land. Now, how did that get to America? Well, centuries later, the Irish and Scots immigrants brought Halloween to the New World. After massive immigrations after the potato famine in 1845 and 46, the Irish came to the United States and they brought the Halloween with them. And, of course, it just continued to catch on as it continues to catch on today, all the more, becoming more and more popular. Of course, we recognize the pagan origins of Halloween. And many Christians do. Maybe they don't see those origins of Christmas and Easter and that type of thing, but many people, even outside of our church, are bothered by the concept of Halloween and what it represents. And they feel in their conscience that they shouldn't keep it or shouldn't keep it in the way that so many people do. There's all kinds of debate. If you get on the internet, people discussing this, you'll see everything from, it's just a fun thing from the kids, to, there's no way that Christians should ever be celebrating this. And again, this is even within mainstream Christianity. Today I'd like to talk about some important principles that we should consider this time of year, especially as the world, so many people delve into the evil realms. I just got a text on email today from a newspaper advertising a special article I could go to and see the top 10 horror movies this week. And I thought, nope, I don't think I'm going to be visiting that, but this is what everybody's has in front of them now. Of course, we recognize that as Christians, we should not be participating in Halloween. But what are some of the principles that guide that? I think it's important for us to consider because as the world marches toward the time of the end, the power and the influence of Satan and the demonic realm is just going to increase. I think that's part of the reason we see it, an increase of people, an increase of interest in Halloween, is because there is a spirit world, and spirits are behind these things. The Catholic Church tried to Christianize Halloween, and they failed. They succeeded in, quote, Christianizing other holidays, other pagan holidays, but it's as if Satan wasn't going to let this one go. This was the one that honored him, and he wasn't going to let it go. And he hasn't, and people continue to thrive at this time of year in that kind of realm of the horror, of death, ghosts and goblins and all of that. Let's turn back to Leviticus 19, if you will, Leviticus 19, just to rehearse some of the principles, again, that we look at, especially this time of year. Some of the principles that we have to, of course, at the appropriate age, teach our children, why we don't do some of these things. And again, in the case of Halloween, such an obvious evil holiday. Leviticus 19, verse 31 says, "Give no regard to mediums or familiar spirits. Do not seek after them to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." We can seek after these evil spirits, these beings that truly exist, whether it's Satan or the demonic realm. We can seek after them. We can show interest in that realm and that world, so to speak. And it defiles us. It says here, do not be defiled by them. And so we can truly be defiled by the things that we see in the world around us this time of year. And it's one thing that we want to stay away from. We certainly don't want to be defiled by them. We're told in other places, you shall not permit a sorceress to live. Exodus 22, verse 18. God considered it a very dire thing to have this kind of pagan religion, sorcery, the working of magic, those who desire to speak to the dead or speak to demons. It was a very bad thing. It was very evil. And they were told to put to death. Leviticus 20, verse 27 says, the man or woman who is a medium, who has familiar spirits, who communicates with the demonic realm, you shall surely put to death. It says they shall be stoned with stones and their blood should be upon them. So be guilty of the heinous sin that they have committed. If we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 13, God actually spends a number of verses warning us about the evil of this type of thing. Leviticus 13 in verse 5, talking about the prophet or dreamer of dreams, the false prophet, the false teacher. Someone bringing in this kind of paganism that God so hates. It says the prophet, in verse 5, Deuteronomy 13, the prophet or dreamer of dreams shall be put to death because he has spoken in order to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of bondage, to entice you from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. You shall put away the evil from your midst. Now, of course, we do not live in ancient Israel today. We do not have our own government. The church does not run the country we live in, and that's not the way it should be. Christ will rule when he returns. And I'm sure that things like these decorations that we see on our streets will not be allowed. It will be an evil which Christ will say we shall not have in our midst, shall not allow that to be among us. We, unfortunately, live in a world in which we see it all around us. And it's not appropriate for us, of course, to go destroying that and try to remove that from our neighbor's yard. Of course, would be wrong and illegal. But we certainly look forward to a time when evil shall be removed from our midst, and we don't have to live amidst all of that. Deuteronomy 18, a few pages over. Deuteronomy 18 and beginning verse 10. Says, there shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire. And of course, human sacrifice is something that most people today would absolutely detest. But some of these religions certainly practiced that. And I'm preparing another message where we talk about why that was done. Why would people sacrifice their children? This is one of those heinous things that they caused them to pass through the fire. But it goes on to say, he who practices witchcraft, a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord. Because of those abominations, the Lord your God will drive them out before you. So the people of Canaan had become very, very evil before God actually drove them out and allowed the Israelites to come in and take the land. And some of the things they were practicing involved some of these very things that we see that are glorified this time of year in so many ways, in movies, in parties. We see these kind of evils done, oftentimes just done in fun, sometimes done in a very serious way, as people truly believe they can communicate with a dead relative, and something like that. These are things that we simply don't want to be involved with. Let's go to the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We see involvement in these things in God's law is prohibited, and it's an abomination. It's not something that is fun. Should be fun for us. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 20, it says, "Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons, and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons." Notice that's a very direct statement, that so many of the things that the world does, even if they don't consciously do it, they're doing it as a worship to the demonic realm, tipping their hat to the demonic realm. And oftentimes they don't realize it. Certainly in Paul's day, they didn't think they were sacrificing to demons. They were sacrificing to pagan gods. Well, his point is that's exactly what they are. These pagan gods are the same thing as demons. And sometimes we don't look at it that way. But that's the way that Paul put it. So participation in that type of these types of things, witchcraft, soothsaying, sorcery, spells, mediums, spiritists, that is a form of worship of the demonic realm. Even if a person doesn't see it that way, the Bible indicates that what they're doing to demons. Verse 21 says, "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot participate at the Lord's table and the table of demons." It's a very strong disconnect that Paul talks about here between that evil realm and God's realm, between those who practice these abominable things and us who should be staying away from them. There's no mixing of the two. According to Scripture, these are absolute opposites. And many people who participate in it would agree the rest of the year. But this time of year, for some reason, there seems to be a get out of jail free card, if you will. You can do it this time. Perhaps they think in some way the Catholic Church has given permission because of the All Saints' Day. Some people will say, well, I'm just keeping All Saints' Day. They're doing it in the way that the world keeps Halloween, Samhain. So we have very clear delineation in the Old Testament and New Testament. We are to stay away from these type of things, again, because Satan and the demonic realm is behind it. And they are certainly real. We're not to focus our attention on witchcraft, demonism, everything that flies in the face of the holy God. Again, to teach our children why it's wrong, as their age is appropriate to know some of these things. And early on, it's probably just fine to tell them we don't celebrate it. It's not something we do. Rather than going into all the details. But as they get older, we teach them why we don't do it. I remember as a young person in the church, I remember even being very young, recognizing in my own conscience why that was wrong. And with Halloween, it was so easy to see. I really didn't have a desire. I know I desired that candy. But as I got older, I didn't have the desire to go out and trick or treat and participate in some of these things because it's so easy to see the evil in the decorations. And it's right there before everyone. And our children can understand these things. And I think as we teach them about Halloween, it can be a stepping stone toward Christmas, Easter, and some of these other things because they're not as overtly evil. But they do have, as we know, pagan origins, and it can be a little more challenging to teach those things. But perhaps teaching about Halloween is a good stepping stone to doing that. Interestingly enough, most Christians who keep Halloween have tried to put a Christian veneer on it, in some cases at least. If we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 12, we read earlier, the Catholic Church just tried to, we'll just turn the pagan holiday of Samhain into a Christian day. But we're all familiar with Deuteronomy 12 and verse 31, where it says, "You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way." You shall not see what the nation's doing around you, see what the pagans are doing, and say, well, we'll worship God that way. We're told very clearly that God doesn't want to be worshiped that way. If the Catholic Church had factored in Deuteronomy 12, they would have realized that you can't just create an All Saints' Day and worship or revere the dead saints on the same day that the pagans are all dealing with and thinking about dead people and spirits and ghosts. But because it was so easy to, quote, convert these holidays, that's exactly what they did. But God says that's not the way He wants to be worshiped. Some people think it's our right to worship God however we want. If I want to keep All Saints' Day, then I have the right to worship. I can worship God. He has to accept my worship the way I want to worship Him. Now, they don't oftentimes put it in those terms, but that's in essence what it is. Rather than looking and asking God, how do you want to be worshiped? They demand that God accept their worship however it is. And of course, we recognize that God simply doesn't. He tells us there are ways He does not want to be worshiped. There are people in the Christian community who have decided that, we'll Christianize Halloween. Instead of the faces on the jack-o'-lanterns, we'll draw crosses. We'll cut crosses in them. So sometimes you'll see jack-o'-lanterns. I don't know if they call them cross-o'-lanterns, but they'll have crosses in them because we're gonna make it more Christian, not recognizing that again God just doesn't want us to take the pagan and make it into something Christian. It's something that God abhors. But they wish to do it this way, not recognizing that God sees the pagan ritual behind it very clearly. And God sees it more than we do. God observed all the evil that was being done as people kept Samhain. He's seen this festival come through time. 2,000 years ago is yesterday to God. As far as He's concerned, yesterday He saw these abominations being done by these peoples. And now, the same things, just by a Christian community. And you can understand from that perspective why it would leave a very bad taste in His mouth. What about another thing that many Christians will do to try to make Halloween better is, we'll dress up in Bible characters. No ghosts and goblins coming out of my house. We're going to show up as Moses or Jesus Christ or John the Baptist, hopefully before he was beheaded. But they'll do these things. They'll dress up, try to make it better. They'll sugarcoat it. Again, not recognizing that Satan is indeed behind these things. I have an article that I printed off the internet from another person. This is not someone in the church. This is someone that's part of the mainstream Christianity. And he writes an article titled Halloween, Should Christians Participate? And he writes this. He says, should Christians participate in this popular holiday? This is a question I've been asking for a long time. Some Christians believe that any participation in Halloween is satanic and sinful, while others believe it's a harmless tradition to be enjoyed by all. I've come to the conclusion that it probably isn't as black and white as we would wish. And he goes through the history of Halloween as we know it. And he says this. He says, I would argue that it's not as harmless as we might think. Even the casual observer can see that Halloween is a time that celebrates death, fear, and the supernatural. Indeed, the whole idea of dressing up and going house to house comes from a similar Samhain tradition that was meant to disguise and hide oneself from the angry spirits. And while witches and ghosts and vampires, etc., may seem harmless things of the past to a modern 21st century sensibility, they reflect our human interest in a very real spiritual world. And I'll continue quoting from him. He says, it is a reality that should not be taken lightly. As we see several times in the Acts and the Gospels, Jesus and his disciples interact where they cast out demons. Demons, he writes, have real power and cause real suffering in people's lives. And he goes on to quote Ephesians 6, verse 12, where it says, we do not struggle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, against powers of the dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly realms. That's a good scripture to consider. Again, this person isn't in our organization, but is in the mainstream Christian community. He says, talks about in recent years there's been more of an influx of horror movies, and that has only continued on. I think perhaps we have a bit less because of the COVID and what's gone on in Hollywood. But, almost anybody can make a horror flick. It doesn't have to be a high-end movie, just a B movie that very little budget. But this particular author decries these things. And then the conclusion he comes to in the end is, okay, maybe we should be more missionary Christians on Halloween. So if, along with the Snickers bar that we give out, give a Bible tract. Along with the Milky Way, give an invitation to church services next week. And so that's his conclusion. Not to participate, going and trick-or-treating and all that, but you can give the candy away, just do it in a missionary way. And I found that to be very interesting. Of course, the comments after his article was even more interesting, seeing people who, some agree, some disagree. It kind of created a bit of a heated debate about, is this really wrong? Is it really something that we ought to be doing? And some of those comments, some of the people very much appreciated his thoughts. I thought that was interesting too. But we have such a diverse attitude toward Halloween and modern Christianity. Let's go back to Amos chapter 5. It's a very telling scripture. God tells us that He hates your feast days here. Amos chapter 5. The interesting thing about this is he's really not talking about all these pagan days. Certainly, pagan days could be included. But in this case, in Amos 5, I won't read through all the context, but Amos 5 verse 21 says, I despise your feast days, and I do not savor your sacred assemblies. He goes on to talk about, of course, the context here is because of their sinfulness. You could come and keep the Sabbath. But if we're just practicing sin all during the week, it's not something that, God doesn't appreciate us sitting here as if we're all self-righteous and we willingly participate in all this sin. It would cause Him to see that as a hypocritical thing. And He would hate the fact that we're assembled here, thinking that we can somehow gain His favor by being here and just sin the rest of the week. In this case, he's talking about those of His people who were unjust, not practicing righteousness, but they would sacrifice and think everything's okay. Do the ritual, and it doesn't matter if I've done all this sin or living in this way. And God says He despises that. Even if it's our God's feasts, the feasts that we keep, our Sabbath day, God's Sabbath day, if we're doing it without living justly and living righteously, then it comes across as very hypocritical. If God can hate and despise the very days, the assemblies that He has commanded because of their sin, how much more do you think He can despise the pagan assembly, pagan holidays? Again, God knows everything that's been associated with these days throughout time, and He remembers these things. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 30, just some additional principles here before we close that we can be thinking about and even teach our children about as we see this Halloween coming up. Notice Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, where God says, I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life. We are to choose life. We are to value life. Not curses, not death. But in the world, and Halloween as we see it today, it's a day in which death is glamorized in many ways. Where cursing and those who curse, witches and that type of thing, are honored in one way or another. He says we are to choose life. Another principle that we can teach our children about is in John chapter 1, verse 5. John chapter 1 and verse 5, where it says, God is light, and in Him is no darkness at all. In this world, we may have faithful Christians who try to live as best they can all during the year, but on Halloween, it's the day that they throw all that off and they dress up in these evil characters and they watch the horror movies. They delve themselves into the darkness. Even if it's one day, I guess that could be a justification, but God says there is no darkness at all in Him. And so we can teach our children that, no, it doesn't matter that it's one day. it is still darkness. And God doesn't have any darkness in him. God is light. And we don't focus on those things, even for a day or a night that is all about darkness. The demon-filled movies, the haunted houses that are all about fear. These are the things that people kind of enjoy this time of year. And we have to be careful about that. Let's go back to Ephesians Chapter 5. Again, we can teach our children this because in Ephesians 5 it mentions children. And it's talking about us as all of God's children, but for our young people, I think it's interesting that to them that the idea of children is even mentioned here. God speaks to them as well. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 8, where it says, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the world. Walk as children of light." That's the way we are to be, as children of light. "For the fruit of the Spirit is all goodness, righteousness, and truth." Finding out what is acceptable to God. Again, this is delving into the demonic realm, an acceptable thing. Of course not. Verse 11, "And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret." Some of these pagan cultures which we derive so much of what we look today, so many look to as Christian holidays, God doesn't appreciate the unfruitful works of darkness that they have come from. And we are to rather expose them, to recognize where they came from, and not have fellowship with them in that sense of the word. If we go back to 1 John chapter 4, I've never enjoyed horror movies and that type of thing. It's just, I guess, my nature. I never was drawn to enjoy that. But I'm told by others that there is a kind of thrill of being scared, and maybe being scared half out of your wits, but then at the same time knowing you're safe. But there's an adrenaline that comes from that, but it's just not been something probably because I scare easily, and I would go screaming from the room. I don't want to do that, so I've never been interested. But this is a time in which people enjoy that sense of fear for some reason. But notice we have a number of places. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and of sound mind." But here in 1 John 4, verse 18, says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Because fear involves torment, but he who fears has not been made perfect in love." I think it's important to consider that God doesn't want us to not only live in fear, but to be entertained by that which involves fear. Because so often that fear comes from that demonic realm. And certainly we see the opportunity for Satan to take advantage of where we are. And in fact, we've seen over the years that demons oftentimes will bother or become more part of people's lives who are involved in sin, who are okay with sinning in some way in their life. And the demons don't like to be a part of someone's life who's pure. It's not the way they want to think. They don't care about that. But if they can find people who are living in fear, who are okay with fear, who are okay with the kind of sin that they're okay with, that's the kind of person that they would much rather not just possess in that sense, but certainly bother, certainly hang around and be around in that environment. Sometimes we found over the years that the places where a great deal of sin is taking place are the places that people have deemed to be bothered by a spirit, and say haunted in some way. We sometimes find that a house or something can be bothered by a spirit, and oftentimes it's because of the things that are going on. The demonic realm is being invited in that sense because of that. And certainly it's something we have to be careful with even the entertainment that we see in the world, because so much of that can be an invitation to be bothered by the spirit world, and it's something we certainly want to take seriously. Before we close, I thought I would mention that there is a blog article on Life, Hope, and Truth that came out on October 29th, just yesterday. The 4 quote, Christian excuses for celebrating Halloween. And it's written by Eddie Foster. And he goes through what I think are some interesting excuses. He says, first of all, it doesn't have to be celebrated as dark and evil. And it's true. I mean, a person, I guess, could leave all that out, but it is still Halloween. It is still a holiday that derives from evil and from darkness. The second excuse is, well, when we dress up to trick or treat, we're really celebrating All Saints' Day. I mentioned that one earlier, but again, is it really? And even if we're celebrating All Saints' Day, there aren't saints alive in heaven. All that's derived from paganism too. The third one here, Halloween is fun for the kids, even the adults, and everyone else is doing it. Boy, we have to deal with that, don't we, as parents? Everyone else is doing it. I had one person mention to me this week talking about how it's very easy to not want to miss out on something, the fun that everyone else is having. And sometimes that can be a difficult thing to teach our young people. You know, if everyone else is having fun, they don't want to miss out. But if we think about it, there are things we do want to miss out on. And the older we get, the more we see that there are certain things that we don't want any part of at all. I think it's important to teach our children that we don't base our decision based on missing out. We don't base our decisions on whether it's fun or not. There are many fun things that God says we're not to participate in because they're not good for us in the long run. And to teach them that it's okay to miss out. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a blessing in many cases to miss out on certain things because we don't have to deal with the repercussions that come down the line of participating in some of that. The fourth thing mentioned in this article is we aren't Satanists. We just like dressing up and having a party. Well, there's all kinds of ways that we can justify. I've heard that one perhaps most often. I'm not worshiping Satan, but everything revolving around this holiday, it revolves around Satan. It's hard to divorce the two, no matter what our personal intent is. It's the way certainly God sees it. Let's conclude over in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. Because it's a scripture here, it's a warning to us, and I think it's one that we're going to have to take all the more seriously as we see Christ's return imminent. Because we're going to see, and I think we are seeing it in the world around us, an increase. It's going to continue to increase. Satanic activity and demonic activity and influence is going to be there. It's going to increase. And we are told here in 1 Peter 5, verse 8, to be sober. It says, be sober and be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith. This is the kind of attitude that we're going to have to resist Satan, to realize that as a roaring lion, he's seeking any avenue to influence us. And he's certainly seeking any avenue to influence the world. And as God pulls back his restrictions on Satan and allows him to do more, we're going to see more and more demonic activity. We're going to see that more and more. And it wouldn't surprise me that we see more and more people who relish that type of thing, whether knowingly or unknowingly, involve themselves in that type of activity. I think Halloween is just a beginning. It's kind of like the on-ramp to a lot of activity that's going to be even worse that we see in society around us. So, brethren, as we see these decorations, as we see all the parties going on, I hope that we can remember these principles. They're going to be all the more important as time goes by. I hope that we can teach them to our children because it's very important for them to understand them as well. And I hope that we can focus on the things, as Philippians 4:8 tells us, focus on the things that are good, that are righteous. That's where our focus is to be. We are truly to come out of the world. And one of the ways that we do that is not participating in any way with the dark realms.